turn it on. Hello. Oh, that's loud.
Hello.
Sorry.
Wow. Awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I know it's Friday, usually work from home day, so thank you for being here. I have the absolute pleasure of having Julia Boorstin being with us today. I was very fortunate to be selected as one of the key stories in her book, which has been phenomenal success. I continue to be impressed of how much coverage she has gotten since she published the book. But before that, Julia is a very, very prominent reporter at CNBC, and I would love to have her introduce herself and tell us more about her story.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. I was very lucky to get to meet you and interview you actually when I was working on the book proposal for When Women Lead. I'm sorry I don't have a copy with me today, but Snejina's story is featured in the first chapter. And I was trying to figure out how to illustrate the success of female founders despite the odds. And when I heard about, I think you had just raised a round, and I wanted to explain how hard it was to do that. And so we started this conversation, and I included your story in the book proposal, and then we went back and did more interviews for the book. So it was really an honor and a pleasure, so thank you. But my brief story is that I've been a reporter at CNBC for 16 years, and before that I was at Fortune magazine for 6 years. And in that time, in those 22 years, I've interviewed literally thousands of CEOs and leaders. The vast majority have been men, the vast majority have been white men. And in the past 5 or 7 years, I started noticing more and more women, especially as entrepreneurs. And one of my favorite projects at CNBC is I do this list called the Disruptor 50 list, which we do every year, focusing on the 50 fastest growing private venture-backed startups. And seeing more women running those companies, I noticed how differently they seem to be solving problems, and also how hard it was for them to raise funding. So that's why I wanted to the project started off as a way of highlighting the women who had defied the odds being that in the past decade, an average of about 3% of all venture capital dollars have gone to female-led companies. And last year, that number dipped to 2%. So last year, 2% of VC dollars went to female-led companies, about 15.5% went to co-ed teams, and 82% of all VC dollars went to male-only founding teams. So I first started off wanting to tell the stories of the women who had defied the odds, and then it sort of turned into this research project of understanding the leadership characteristics and strategies that women are more likely to use, but in fact would be incredibly valuable for anyone.
What inspired you to write the book?
Mostly the amazing women I was meeting. It's funny because today Elizabeth Holmes is getting her sentencing, and it's hard not to talk about that or to acknowledge that her story and her phenomenal failure is a very dominant story in our culture. And I think there's a lot of attention paid on these massive failures of women and less attention paid to the success stories. So I was meeting these amazing women, such as yourself, and just thinking like, these stories are amazing. More people need to know these stories. And through the Disruptor 50 list, I was interviewing these women, whether it was like Jennifer Holmgren, who runs a company called LanzaTech that turns pollution into fuel, or Jenn Hyman, who is founder of Rent the Runway. I was like, these women are amazing. More people need to know their stories and know that leaders aren't just all Elizabeth Holmes.
Very good point. What are some of the key characteristics you have found when you evaluated different female leaders?
So I ended up doing about 120 interviews, thanks to the magic of Zoom during the pandemic. And I went from the interviews to sort of, after every interview, I'd write down which traits each of these women represented, and then I sort of dove deep went down the rabbit hole of academic research. Ended up reading about 300 academic studies, and found so much data around how women tend to lead and how these traits are actually incredibly effective. So a couple of the key skills: women leaders tend to demonstrate more empathy. Again, empathy is something that anyone can practice and deploy, but women tend to do it more frequently. Another key one is vulnerability. Vulnerability is really useful for leaders in terms of inviting collaboration. One CEO told me no one wants to work for a know-it-all. And I think that definitely has been borne out. And another key one is gratitude. Women are more likely to practice gratitude. This was a real surprise for me. I had no idea about this. and gratitude, practicing gratitude correlates with longer term planning rather than going for the near term win. Those are some of the skills. In terms of strategies, women are more likely to lead with a communal approach, bringing in perspectives from across an organization, also more likely to take a divergent approach, so pulling on threads, things that seem tangential maybe, but maybe paint a fuller, bigger picture of the forest rather than just honing in on a tree. And then women are also more likely to found purpose-driven companies. There's a lot of data around that. So to have some additional purpose, societal or environmental, in addition to profits. So there's so much data about this I didn't realize, and to be able to pull it all into one place I think was helpful.
That's so inspiring, especially when we have the numbers of 2% only female founders get the VC funding. What are some of the challenges you were able to see when the women are facing when they're fundraising?
Well, so many of them, and we talked about this a little bit in our interview. You all have to read her story. And you just mentioned this, but when we first did the interview, you talked about some of the challenges you faced, and then when you were reading it, when we were fact checking at the end, you said, "Did I say too much? Was I too honest?" You talked about how people asked you about your kids, because they assume that no CEO who has kids, a woman, could possibly do her job and also be a parent. I think that there's a lot of sort of pattern matching that goes on, and investors are not malicious. They're just looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg, or they're looking for the next Jeff Bezos, and you do not look like Mark Zuckerberg, and your business model and your approach is not the sort of move fast and break things model that really dominated the tech scene for so long. So I think that there's a lot of pattern matching in the fact that there is like, these investors are trying to figure out how someone who has a family is also going to run a business. Like, no one's asking male CEOs who have kids that same question, and it sort of perpetuates this homogeneity over and over.
Yeah, one of my experiences was that what I found is that male founders are much more likely to sell on vision versus sell on numbers, and I always relied on execution. It was just execution, and there was one note that I heard from someone that I highly respect, my husband, who said, "Revenue solves all the problems." So that's what we focused on, just building a sustainable business and executing and proving that we can build and grow the business by just focusing on the right things. I remember one conversations with a VC that was the round before the round that we talked with, that at that time, we were 10 people making $8 million of revenue. And his comment was like, "I'm sure your numbers are not as good as you tell me they are." And I was like, wow, I can't believe that he said that. Well, we did execute, and I'm super fortunate to have all of you here today, because most of you have been a key part of that success. What are some of the other characteristics that you see female leaders sort of excelling during your research?
Well, I think a key thing is figuring out how not to let that kind of bias bother them. And that's something that really struck me when I heard these stories, or you going into a meeting and questions being directed at your husband and not at you, and you being like, "Hello, I'm the CEO here." I think it was really interesting to understand how you could face that kind of bias over and over and over and not let it hold you back. And that's something that I just was very impressed by. And I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but a number of CEOs told me that once they realized they were going to be able to, that they knew what they were going to face, they could handle it and navigate it. And another CEO I interviewed, she's the CEO, the founder of a company called Little Bits, which is like a kids tech company. She's an engineer. Her name is Aya Badir. She's a Lebanese immigrant, and she said she faced so many different kinds of discrimination for everything, for her religion, for the fact that she was an immigrant. She was like, I could, at every turn there was discrimination. And I said, how did you not let it get you down? Like, it would have driven me crazy if someone had directed questions at my partners instead of at me. And she said, once I knew I was going to face discrimination, I just thought of it like remembering to wear a jacket when it's cold out. If you know it's going to be cold, you bring your jacket. You're going to notice that it's cold, but it's not going to bother you in the same way. And so you could use that protection of the jacket to identify, okay, what's the valuable feedback here? What can I learn from? And then what is it that's totally irrelevant because it's biased, and set that aside so it doesn't bother me. So that was something I really was impressed by.
Yes, for me, it was just don't quit. don't quit. It's a big market. It's a huge problem. We're not coming up with a problem that doesn't exist, which, as I have been a founder, I have talked to tons of startups and tons of founders that do focus on problems that don't exist, and that's a big problem. But I knew that we had a big problem to solve, and I just focused on doing that. What is the advice you have for female founders, and maybe any founders?
I think for anyone in the workplace, I do think understanding the obstacles that you're up against. I used to subscribe to the sort of serenity prayer of like, the things that you can't control, don't worry about them. You know, only focus on the things that you can control. But I actually think seeing the success of women like you, it's really important to understand the things you can't control. Think about those things, understand the ratios of gender discrimination or your chances of getting funding or what's going to happen in the room. That's going to enable you to be more successful. And I think about some of the anecdotes I've heard from women saying, you know, I knew that I was going to be judged more harshly if I gave feedback to my employees. By the way, there's a laundry list of ways in which women are judged more harshly and double standards. And one of the CEOs said, I had read this study saying if I gave critical feedback, my employees would really hate me for it. So I'm in a growth phase. I don't have time to deal with this. Ultimately, I want to be able to give my feedback, but right now, I need to move on with my day. So she wrote out the list of different types of feedback. She delegated someone else to give it. And she said, ultimately, I don't want to end up in this situation where I can never deliver really harsh feedback myself, but understanding what I'm up against is going to help me navigate it. So I think know your landscape, know the obstacles, I think is essential. But one thing that's also true of these women who have succeeded like yourself is like you had a very clear set of your goals. You understood what your plan was, your own roadmap to success, and you didn't let anyone else define that. And there's some really fascinating data about female athletes, women who've been athletes in college and in high school, and they tend to be more successful in business. I was not an athlete. Were you an athlete? No.
No.
Yeah. So, but I wanted to understand why this was, especially as someone who was not an athlete. I can't go back in time and have played volleyball in high school. So, but what it really came down to is the reason why female athletes tend to perform better is they have frequent experience with failure. You lose half the games on average, and they're trained after every game to go back, review the tape, figure out what they could have done better, and treat every experience as a learning experience. Every game, every win, every failure is a learning experience. And I think the more we can all think of ourselves as athletes, every meeting, every pitch, every project, you're gonna bomb some of them, and that's okay because you're gonna learn from that. And I think the more we can sort of treat ourselves as sort of athletes in training at work, the better.
Yeah, one of the things I have read is that investors will make decision in the first 10 seconds of whether or not they want to invest. So there is not much data you can provide in 10 seconds. And I saw that over and over again. Like I knew from the moment I opened my mouth whether somebody is in or out. And it was an interesting experience.
But so what do you do in that situation when you know they're making a decision that has nothing to do about, it's not at all based on data?
You just keep close to the core and just focus on selling the vision and selling the results and just keep adding. There is very little you can do because you can see from their body language, from the way they ask the questions, from how much time they give you in the first place. Because some of them will just get a meeting just because they were introduced to you and they want to be kind. But if you tell them you're in California and you're on their drive, on their street, and they say they only have 30 minutes for you, then you know that call is not going to go very well. I remember a call with Sequoia. The first question was, where are you located? Like, okay, that is not going well. I'm on the East Coast. Which is also something about East Coast and West Coast, right?
Yeah.
So sometimes it doesn't even have to do with being female, it's just location. But in my case, it was just about focus on creating a clear vision, focusing on not chasing the fancy, cool tech, and just focus on really building the value and the technology and making sure that we stay true to also being exceptionally diligent in terms of financial performance. Like for the longest time, we never lost a single dollar on marketing, on the money, and that was very important. I remember talking with male founders, and they were like, Snejina, when are you going to raise money? And I was like, when I decide. And the truth was that I just didn't think I had enough to go out and get the next round. I just didn't think it was enough, knowing what I had to go through.
But that's really interesting, and I have to note, so there's this, I think we talked about your A or your B round, for the first
after
time.
the B round.
The B round. So there's this interesting data showing that when men and women are fundraising at the seed, A, and B level, men are more likely to raise money. And that's before there's much of a track record. Once you get to the C, when there's a proven track record, and there's like plenty of data once anyone's at the C stage, men and women actually raise at the same level. And so that, I actually had this organization called All Raise, which is focused on fundraising, pull this data for me. And they said, and they have all these stats, and I have them in the book, but like at the A, you have like the percentage of women who raise versus men, and then B, and then once you get to C, it's like women are, and then any rounds beyond that, if you can get to that phase, men and women are raising equally. And that is so powerful because it indicates once the numbers speak for themselves, things start to change.
Yeah. What are some of the other data points you have seen through the data and the research that you did on the book?
Oh, there's so many. But I think that's, I mean, if you look at the fundraising, once the data speaks for itself, that's a key thing. I think that there's the research about the double standards that women face are mind-boggling. There are probably about 50 different studies about all the ways women are judged more harshly for things like I mentioned the thing about how women are judged more harshly if they deliver feedback to their employees, which is crazy. Women are judged more harshly for showing any sort of emotion in the workplace. They're judged more harshly for showing anger, obviously. Also for demonstrating humor. Women are judged more harshly if they make jokes in the office, which I think is hilarious. But the list goes on. Women are judged more harshly if they succeed in a male-dominated field, if they fail in a female-dominated field. I mean, you would have to contort yourself into a pretzel to fit all of these different double standards. But there's also a lot of research about how female leaders perform better. Female leaders are more likely to invest in DEI initiatives. They're more likely to mentor both men and women and care about mentorship at their organizations. So I think a lot of these things are great, and men should be doing these things as well. Also, female-led companies tend to return capital to investors a year earlier on average and tend to be more profitable.
I tend to agree.
Yeah.
How do we go, how do we solve the whole issue with unconscious bias? Like, what are some of the suggestions or recommendations you think we can all learn from the 120 companies you have interviewed?
It's so interesting because even women have unconscious bias. People of color have unconscious bias. Everyone has unconscious bias. So what I've seen is the companies that are successful at overcoming it are the ones that institute systems to make sure that they're relying on data to eliminate the potential for bias. I was talking to a female CEO of a company that had gone public, and she was telling me that she was really surprised to see that even her female managers were not paying men and women equally. Even her female managers at a company with a female CEO were paying men more than they were paying women. She's like, this is crazy. If we're not doing equitable pay at a female-led company with female managers aren't paying equitably, then like we need to create systems for this. So I think needs to be this acknowledgement that like no one's going to figure this out on their own. We can't say, oh, if your heart's in the right place, you're going to pay equitably. You just need to have systems and data to make sure that you're measuring and really thoughtful about how you're doing this. And companies like PayPal and Salesforce have created very thoughtful, data-driven systems to make sure they're not only paying equally, but promoting equally. And that's a lot of where the pay gap ends up happening. And also you end up losing women from the C-suite because men get promoted much faster. So I just think data and systems, and not leaving things to chance and human instinct is the only way to overcome it. But ultimately, if you do rely on the data, I do think more funding is going to flow to women. I think women are going to end up being more successful because they have, because the data indicates that diversity is not a nice thing to do, but it is a financial imperative.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any questions from the group? Yes?
You mentioned that like women face like the double standard, and also read some research about like how women are like more harshly judged. Like if both men and women in the position of leaders display the same sort of like trait of dominance, women would be assertive.
Yeah.
And more like, you know, more kind of like traits of leaders. So I'm just curious about where is the sweet point, like the sweet spot of like balancing between being aggressive, being assertive, and being kind of like more subtle in that sense as a woman in a position of leadership.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And one of the female VCs I interviewed who has seen some of her female leaders get canceled and are brought down for behaving in a way that a lot of male leaders would behave. There's this sort of paradox where you have to be both a strong female leader and a strong male leader at the same time. I actually am hopeful that men are going to start to adopt some of these traits. And the truth is I wrote my book for men to read to understand that the ways in which women lead are incredibly effective. So my whole theory is that we are a culture that celebrates exceptionalism and outliers, and women like you who have succeeded despite the odds are those outliers. And the traits people like you have used to succeed despite those odds are things that everyone needs to adopt. So I think in order for women to be able to be assertive or aggressive and not seen as bitchy or harsh, which is a term I've been called a lot, harsh, which whatever. But I think that we need men to be able to lead in their own ways as well. And so I hope that men start to adopt more of these traits that women have traditionally led with, like empathy, like vulnerability, and men should be able to lead with those traits, and women should be able to lead with more traditionally male traits. So I think it sort of will require an evening of the playing field. But I do think sort of if you look at like the waves of different leadership strategies, when I was a young business reporter, like this GE model of leadership was how everyone was supposed to lead, right? Like cut the bottom 10%, hierarchical top-down leadership. Then in the past decade, it was like the Mark Zuckerberg, move fast and break things, innovate, launch products before they're ready. And now I think we're in a new phase coming out of the pandemic where, we were just talking about flexibility. And I think that we're in a new phase now where everyone, male and female, is trying to figure out like, how do I become a good leader? And I would argue that now more than ever, whether you're dealing with inflation and economic downturn or just the challenge of engaging with employees in a hybrid work environment, that men need to lead more like women and women need to lead more like themselves. And part of that is in traditionally male ways as well.
Can I have a follow-up question on that? So how can we get male leaders to participate in the conversation when the field is dominated by male leaders and they are the ones benefiting from it? So why would they want to change when they are the privileged workplace benefiting from it? And women are like the minority. Why would they change?
So I want them to read my book. So in the book I really lay out why they need to be leading in these ways right now. Everyone needs to be leading in these ways. I think it's table stakes now for leaders to be empathetic. I don't think that you can engage with employees without being empathetic and vulnerable because in terms of vulnerability, nobody knows everything right now because the world's changing so quickly. And if you don't admit that, you're gonna miss out. And then empathy, you can't connect with your customers or your employees, all of whom are going through different situations now without that empathy. So in the book, I lay out a financial argument for A, acting more like female leaders have, and B, investing more in women. And I argue that it's not like a nice thing to do. You're gonna be more profitable and you'll make more money if you adopt these things. And as a reporter for CNBC, I know the way to get people's attention is not by talking about philanthropy, but by talking about profits. So that's the argument of my book. You should all read it.
Any other questions?
Give it to your male bosses. Yeah.
Tanvi?
It's actually for both of you. So Julia, you must have heard some pretty horrible stories while interviewing everyone. But what was the worst that really made you feel horribly about the state of the world? And Snejina, what was an experience that you had that you felt was really hard to come back from, where you faced discrimination for being a woman in tech?
It's interesting because we're 5 years out from the Time's Up Me Too movement. It's been 5 years now. And a lot of women in the VC space in San Francisco and in the Silicon Valley area came together after that movement. And there were a couple of very high profile men who behaved very badly. And a lot of women told me they couldn't talk about what had happened to them because they had signed non-disclosure agreements. And to me, going around the contours of that conversation was really, I could only imagine how bad things were for those women. And I think this idea that like women were, that men who were on their boards were harassing them. I mean, there was a lot of that going on. And then I think just on a more sort of mundane level, the number of women who had to pitch to literally thousands of investors. There's one woman I write about, Irma Olguin, who runs a company out of Fresno. She's a gay Latina, and she was like, her parents are farm workers, and she faced so much discrimination, and so many people failed to take her seriously. And she says she did 1,000 pitch meetings. And the idea, and like her company now is thriving, and they just raised another big round. But the fact that she wasn't taken seriously because of her identity is crazy. And then I think they're the more serious, like horrible things that happened 5+ years ago. I think now that we've gone from like this horrible behavior to more just sort of mundane discrimination, that's more like death by 1,000 cuts.
I have a lot of good stories in the book. So please go on Amazon and buy one. We did order free copies, but unfortunately they were not delivered yet. So maybe by the end of this session we'll pick them up from downstairs. So I don't think that there was one bad story. I think it's just that understanding that the deal is done before you even started talking, because they've made a decision before you even open your mouth, based on whatever they've decided. You don't sound like them, you don't look like them. I got the education right, that was a plus mark, but other than that, I didn't check any of the boxes. So that was probably the most disheartening. And then here and there you hear the questions about how old your kids are, and at the time that there were 2- and 4-year-old, and then there were 3- and 5-year-old, and quite a few VCs were like, wow, you probably spend a lot of time taking up your kids. And I'm like, wow, okay. Yes, I do. Or the question around, I've been asked about my age. It's crazy. There's like so many. And the feedback that I shared about us overperforming and them disbelieving, because apparently a lot of the boy founders are actually mispresenting their numbers. So I've always been on the cautious side.
Yeah, and there's data about how men are more likely to present their results as they imagine them being in a year, whereas women are more likely to talk about like the actual results that they've had in a year coming up to where they are.
Yeah, there's also data that say that women are actually much less likely to overpromise. So they underpromise and overdeliver, where on the other side it's the other way around. You're always expected to overdeliver. Over the years, I've reached out to a few male founders asking for advice and feedback, and their feedback was like, always, our own VCs told us that when we are pitching forecast for VC funding, you always get 30 to 50% higher. In some cases, 2x than what you think you're gonna meet, because guess what? All the VCs know that you're overestimating, so they'll discount your numbers anyway. And if we go out with our fair value of what we think growth would look like, that doesn't look good enough. Or just promising on the basis of hope versus on the base of foundation, which is what I've always tried to get back to. Any other questions? Yes?
Given that it's so hard for female entrepreneurs to find capital, and you just exactly certainly there must be a lessons learned from all of the founders, for how do you navigate that? How can you find those VC firms or angels who are more willing to listen versus having to pound the pavement each time?
Well, one thing I heard a lot about, and I think you did a really good job of this, is finding the VCs who are really focused on your industry. And to like go to, and I know you did this, but say who's invested in InsurTech, who is really interested in this area, who's maybe not invested in our competitor, but in this space, because they're gonna get exactly what we're doing. And interestingly, Irma Olguin, who I mentioned, she just took a while to find her the right type of investor. And they're in a kind of unusual space. They're basically building these tech ecosystems. She has a great story. I highly recommend you all read it. Her story is amazing. But it took her a while to figure out which actually would be the right kind of VC for this. So I think it's about really doing your research and also mining those warm introductions, which are still way too powerful. One reason I'm so optimistic is there are all of these organizations right now that are creating speaking of ecosystems, new communities for women and people of color, people who have traditionally had less access to capital, to create cohorts of peers for people to coach each other and navigate as they pitch into the broader ecosystem. So Allraise is doing this. They're based out of San Francisco, but they have groups across the country, and they're putting together groups of founders who are at the same level, same stage, to help each other navigate everything together. And I think creating community and sharing knowledge and best practices of what you've learned is incredibly valuable. And I would say one reason I'm optimistic, that didn't exist 5 years ago. And every year there are more of these organizations, and both for-profit and nonprofit, creating that support system. And no matter what industry you're in or what you're interested in, there are far more resources now than there have ever been before.
So my feedback is, often as a first-time founder, you want to get backed by the top VCs, and everybody is so excited about getting the top brands behind them. But what I found over my own journey, and also looking at what everybody else did, is that it's actually much safer bet in the beginning to get funding from angel investors. The reason for that is that there is very low expectations of following. And if you get money from top VC and then you're not the rocket ship that they betted on, which in 95% of the time you will not be the rocket ship that they hope for because statistics are not there, then they don't follow. And that is a kiss of death. And I have seen not just male-founded companies that have had terrible time doing the next follow-up rounds because they got some of the top VCs in the first round, because everybody else expect your VCs, top VCs, to follow. And if they didn't, that means they have lost their vote of confidence. My other advice is, especially if you're a female founder, try to find a male founder. I'm sorry, but you have to at least increase your odds. So I was very fortunate to have two exceptional male founders, and that did help. That did help because, to be honest, testosterone in the room helps. Yes, you cannot move yours, but if you bring in one, it does help. And the others, you just focus on execution because numbers don't lie. And it is hard in the early stage because usually you probably don't have enough traction, not enough product market fit. But you can get there if you're just diligent, and be obsessively diligent about financial performance, because I remember talking with, and this is also a testament about female founders versus male founders. A few of my friends, oh, no. Most important thing is speed. No, most important thing is cash, survival. Because there is nobody who will celebrate your speed if you didn't back it up with execution and numbers. So sometimes you just have to be a little bit more cautious and just work on executing.
And I think it's really interesting in this economic environment with less access, everyone has less access to capital. Yeah. And I actually think that the female founders who've had more practice and built up that muscle of the scrappiness, because they've always had less access to capital, may be better equipped, even though now they will probably have even less access to capital than ever.
Yes, this year will be a hard year, and we are in a very fortunate position. Yeah. What other key learnings or key maybe recommendations you could share with the rest of the team? I think probably 95% of the group is not looking to found a company, but for just female leaders and how female leaders can grow, get promoted, get noticed, be liked.
I mean, the likable thing, the likability trap. Women are expected to be likable far more than men are, which is unfortunate because that really has nothing to do with success. I actually think that there's so much I learned about women in self-knowledge, and this idea that you will become better at anything you do if you know what you're good at. And I mentioned the athlete thing before, but this idea that that really understanding your strengths and weaknesses and building teams, and by the way, this is true whether you're running a company or you're just working in a team, really understanding your strengths and weaknesses is essential to anyone's success. And I talk about some women who are talent magnets and able to hire incredibly senior executives to come work at their startups because they admitted what they didn't know. And they said, I'm not good at this. This is my expertise. I'm going to be totally vulnerable about my weaknesses and invite you to come take the lead and and innovate in this area and really be in charge of your own success there. And I think that that takes a certain confidence to be able to admit what you don't know, but also to understand that self-knowledge is like step one of anything. And there were so many women I talked to who said, you know, like one woman, Christine Hunzinger, she runs a company called Castle, which does like back end for retailers. And she's founded multiple companies, and she said that at one point someone said to her, "You're the most competitive person I've ever met," and I don't mean that in a good way. And she had this great competitive drive, but she was alienating her team. So she had to say, like, look, this is great that I'm competitive, but I need to leverage this and deploy it in a way that's effective. I need to be better at bringing my team with me and motivating them. And so I think it's all about really breaking down your strengths and weaknesses and creating systems so you're constantly evaluating yourself and your own progress. Set those benchmarks for yourself. Everyone's going to be totally different. And I think one thing that's really interesting is like not trying to think about competing against any peer or anyone else. It's only about your own benchmarks and success, and that's how you're going to push your own progress. And I think that's true regardless of whether you're founding a company or just trying to succeed in your workplace.
Do you have any other questions? Yes, Steve?
Gained success and a lot of notoriety in the space, how have you found the texture or landscape of the industry to have changed, if at all, and attitudes towards women? Do you see any kind of shift?
I think, unfortunately, a lot of it is PR. I'm not sure if there is too much of a progress. That said, in the insurance industry, there are some companies that are doing a phenomenal job hiring and promoting female leaders. For example, Liberty Mutual is one of them. If you look up there, C-level, they have CMO, partnerships, communications, you name it. So I've always been surrounded by heavily male-dominated industries, even before that with Gartner. So I have noticed that I've started to not pay attention, and that's actually scary, because sometimes I look around and it's like, yes, I am the only one in the room that is not female, and it is scary that I have become insensitive or unaware of it. I just go with it, and that's kind of unfortunate. There is progress, as Julia mentioned, and Julia probably has a lot of research that she can share. She does have a lot of research to share with us, but I think there is progress, but it's a lot of it is just PR. But it looks, I think even PR helps, right? Just talking about it maybe at some point will make a difference, but there is a very slow movement.
I actually think it's interesting because there's a disconnect between the amount of progress that's actually happening and the amount of progress that's perceived. So for instance, like if you look at the Fortune 500, 8.5% of the CEOs are women. That's an all-time high, and that's up just slightly from last year. But I think there's this perception, since we've had, you know, CEOs on the cover of magazines and CEOs in the press, people are like, oh, but there's been a ton of progress. But if you look at the number of female founders who've taken their company public, it's been 20 over the past 20 years. And it's tiny. And so one thing is, as I've been on this book tour and talking to people around the country, a lot of men, specifically in finance, have been like, what do you mean? Like, the numbers aren't that bad. Where do you even get these numbers? And I'm like, PitchBook, NBCA, like, my numbers are real. Like, the numbers have been widely reported. But I think that this myth of like, the girl boss and the power suit or whatever these things are, I think there is a real disconnect. And I've seen it between how much progress people think has happened and how much progress actually has happened. And things are not moving as fast as people expected or would have thought even 5 years ago. And so I think that's like a really interesting thing to see.
Yeah, there's only one movement that seems to be forced on, which is you need to find a female board of director. So people are chasing female board of directors. That's crazy, which is kind of unfortunate because it almost becomes unnatural. There are just not enough women that get to the level to be eligible for the role to be selected. So there need to be a lot more focus around promoting, around maternity leave, around just covering the basics first before we get to, we are starting from the top, but we haven't covered the basics.
But there was actually a really interesting study from Lena and McKinsey that came out maybe a couple weeks ago, and it showed the pipeline of how men and women are entering the workforce at the same levels. And then at every promotion, men get promoted faster than women. And then if you look down at sort of like literally, it's a great graphic, I'll send it out, but it shows how there's this diminishing pipeline of people who are making it to the C-suite. And the new phenomenon, and this is recent as of this new study, is this idea that women at the VP level and above are leaving their jobs in record numbers. This is the first time they've seen these numbers, and that's because women are frustrated. They don't feel like their work is valued. They feel like other people are taking credit for their work, a bunch of different things. But it's the first time we're seeing that, and that actually has a really negative impact on other women in the workforce, because then you lose the mentorship, you lose the role models, and that's a relatively recent thing. So I think that's another example of how like the progress has not been as great as we would have hoped.
More questions?
Is that correlated to COVID or?
Probably, yeah.
Luba?
I was just curious, were there any topics or stories that didn't make it into the book?
So many. I could have written like 3,000 pages. The book is about 350 pages and 40 pages of endnotes. And I needed the data, so I would be taken seriously. So many amazing stories. I mean, it was such a fun experience during the pandemic to get to interview these amazing women who are so inspiring. And there's so many that didn't make it in, but I'm just excited to watch their progress, and maybe there will be a volume 2. But I think, but especially like in the health tech space, and so many. There were just I only had room for so many, but yeah, so many amazing stories.
Yes, going back to the story of promotion that you were talking about. So I did research on gender pay gap, and one of the reasons that like women earning less than men, considering everything else equal, like job position, education background, family background, everything similar, but their salaries are different. One of the reasons is because there's like an ask gap in which like women tend not to ask for the promotion, for the negotiation as much as men. So my question would be like, what's your advice in those situations, and what can like the management board, like the people who are in more senior positions, can do to be more mindful, to create a more, I guess, like equal, a more inclusive environment for both men and women to ask for what they deserve.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because Salesforce, which thought it had equal pay, discovered that they did have equal pay at the same level, but they were promoting men far faster than they were promoting women, and this was not intentional. And they ended up spending about $3 million to equalize that pay gap and reevaluate how they were doing things. So this is a persistent problem. Again, it's unconscious bias, it's not intentional, but I think the companies that create systems to make sure they're evaluating people and like considering when do we consider people for promotion? How do we make sure we're considering everybody at the same time? We have clear metrics about what it takes to get promoted. It's not the squeaky wheel. We're not just like promoting people because they've asked us 10 times for a promotion. We're making sure we're doing it based on merit. And I think the more those things can be systematized and there's data around them, the better and the more fair companies are going to be. But that's why every management committee needs to figure out like, how are we going to promote people? And I did a story for CNBC on how PayPal does it, and they have these key metrics, they break it down, and they've actually found that creating these very clear systems and the timeline of when you evaluate people, it ends up being more valuable because you retain talent, and their whole employee base feels more valued and isn't worried and wasting energy saying, maybe I need to be asking for promotion now. So it all ends up being more beneficial for everyone, not just for women.
So you're taking the ask out, right? That's
So so you're taking the ask out, or you're figuring out how to equalize it, so make sure that everyone understands every 6 months you're supposed to be asking. This is the thing. And if they don't, the manager says, hey, do you want to ask me about the promotion now, or what do you feel like you're ready for? But I think that the more you make it just like, okay, people get evaluated 2 times a year. People can't get promoted unless they've been in a role for a certain amount of time. This is when it's appropriate. Here are the metrics they need to hit. So it doesn't become the subjective thing of this guy's in my office all the time asking for a promotion. It's like, oh, who's been hitting these sales targets? Who's been hitting these these growth metrics, and then it sort of, it becomes more objective and less subjective, yeah.
Andrew?
Do you face challenges as a female author versus male author? Like male authors?
Sure. I mean, as a journalist, I get all sorts of comments about my interview style. And I tell a story in the book, in the introduction, about how I'd done an interview with a female CEO, and I was negotiating, and I'm constantly trying to get CEOs to do interviews with me on TV. And I got a call from a male communications executive, and I was trying to negotiate with him to get his CEO to come on with me. And he said, I don't know, your tone the other day interviewing Ann Sarnoff, you just seemed really harsh. You seemed really mean in your interview style. And I was like, what do you, at first I panicked, because I was like, wait a second, mean? I'm not mean, I'm fair, I'm a good journalist. And then I remembered all the data I had read, but women are more likely to be judged based on their style than on their substance. And he was expecting me to be warm and nurturing, which is not my job. My job is to be a good journalist. So I said to him, I said, would you have given the same feedback to one of my male colleagues? And he was shocked. And he said, no, I would have expected a harsh tone from a guy. And he said, I have to think about this. And he was right. Like he would have, I did the same exact interview one of my male colleagues would have done, one of my good male colleagues would have done, and I was treated very differently for it. So I think for me, having this wealth of data that's in the book has been really useful and empowering. But I have been questioned. I've had some men ask me where I got my numbers for my book. I was supposed to do an interview with someone about the book, and he said, where did you get these numbers anyways? 8.5% of the Fortune 500? What are you talking about? I was like, this is like not private information. Like this is like very public. You know, there have been articles written about it, or the venture capital dollars, 2%, where'd you get that info? And I was like, well, you know, and like to me this is shocking. I've been a business journalist for 22 years, all blue chip publications. I wrote this amazing book. Simon & Schuster fact-checked it like crazy. There's no error in here, and I still am getting second-guessed. So I sent him links to all of my sources. But to me, that was what, for me, because I have been questioned, I thought it was very important to include the endnotes. So in a lot of books, they'll say links to the endnotes are online. And I talked about it with a publisher, and they said, we think it makes sense to print the endnotes so people can read the resources. And if they have questions, by the way, if you don't like one of my sources, there are a lot of other ones that support the same thing. So that my response to the questioning and the second guessing that I get is always to go back to the data. And I do feel like I have to over prepare and prove myself more because I am a woman, and when I started off in this business, I was a very young woman, and I always felt like I had to do extra homework, but then that made me better prepared as a journalist.
Over-prepared is a very good point.
Yeah.
Literally, over-deliver, over-prepared. More questions? Yes?
I have another question. It's sort of similar to what you were talking about earlier about how you hope that male leaders will adopt some of these characteristics that your book identifies. What is your take on Elon Musk and Twitter?
I've been talking about this with so many people. I don't think he's leading with some of these characteristics. I think he is not leading with empathy or in a communal leadership style. I don't think he's drawing on the perspectives of people who have been there for a long time and may have a lot of knowledge about how these things work. It's going to be really interesting to see how this turns out. I cover Twitter as CNBC's senior media and tech reporter, and I've interviewed him before, and he's very unpredictable. He's also a genius in many ways, so I'm very curious to see how this is going to turn out. I do think the fact that Twitter relies on advertising, and a lot of advertisers have put their spend on hold, will force him to think about what he's doing in a different way. I just think that, like talk about, capitalism correcting, like he's got to create an environment that's safe for advertisers, otherwise the platform won't operate. So I think that's going to be something that's going to keep him somewhat constrained because of the logistics of needing ad revenue.
Although he does look unconstrained right now.
He does.
Yes.
He does. Yeah.
You've covered so many female disruptors, industry disruptors. Are there some specific examples that stood out?
I think, when we talk about disruptors, and I use the term when I created the Disruptor 50 list, now I think it's been used to describe so many other things. I think this idea that when women don't fit the model of what leaders look like, they sometimes feel more liberated to do things their own way and less constrained by the status quo. And I think about Jennifer Holmgren, the CEO of LanzaTech, which converts pollution into fuel. And she was a Colombian immigrant who moved to the US, when she was a kid. She's very soft-spoken. She's a self-professed introvert. She hates to present in meetings, and yet her job is to convince people like Richard Branson to adopt her technology. And I was always sort of curious, like how you can be in such a disruptive field and taking on all these giants and doing things so differently, and also just being so different as a leader than what is expected of someone who is selling a new technology. And she said to me something that I think about a lot, and I think this probably applies to you also. Like she was like, I already didn't fit their expectations of what a CEO is going to look like. I already didn't look like the guy pounding the table and telling them to adopt my new technology. So I wasn't as constrained by all of the ways things have always been done. I could think with a clear head about the way I wanted to do things, the way things should be done, what makes sense now. And so she was liberated by the sort of the constructs that have defined business for so long, and ended up being far more successful because of it. So I think there's something about disruptors not being limited by the existing world, having so much potential because of that.
Yeah, that's so true. What are some of the characteristics of female leaders that you think should be adopted by male leaders?
Well, I think back to that idea of empathy. I think humility, empathy, and vulnerability, and not to dwell too much on Elon Musk, but I do think that in times of volatile, change and instability, and I think we're kind of in a new period of instability where like things are changing all the time with the economy, et cetera. I think that constant reliance on data rather than gut instinct. And women tend to rely more on data. In the book I write about this idea of an adaptability quotient and frequent access to data to look around corners. And this idea that you're not going to figure out what the future is based on your gut, you are by constantly reading the numbers, and that's something women are more likely to do. And I think now more than ever, that's so essential. And I think this idea of adaptability, like success is not based on intelligence, it's based on adaptability.
That's very well put. What is your advice to the group?
I hope you'll read my book and find the stories inspiring as I did. And I think this is like a great moment. We were talking about managing employees, people being in the office a couple days a week, to think about what leadership should look like now. Mm-hmm. I think, despite the fact that Elon Musk isn't running Twitter, I do think this idea, as we've seen Meta do layoffs and so many of these tech companies pull back, think about what is this next generation, what is this next decade of tech going to be about? We know what the last decade was about, and now those companies are all laying off thousands of employees. Where are we now? What should the future look like? What does sustainable growth look like? What do employees who are contributing look like? What do they need to be successful? And figuring out the new metrics for success. And I think that I do feel like this is a change, and where people should be liberated to lead differently. We're in a new moment here in terms of economic pressures, constant need for reevaluating data needs, and thinking about this balancing of long-term and short-term, what's necessary to succeed right now. And so I hope everyone of any gender will think about their own goals, their own skill set, and what the future should look like. Because I think 10 years from now, we're not going to be talking about an era of move fast and break things. I think it's going to be more about sustainable growth, this focus on profitability, on the metrics, and maybe a shift to a more balanced era of leadership where it's not just about leading and I'm not advocating everyone should be leading just like women. I just think people should be able to lead in a more balanced way.
This was very well said. I have been told I'm aggressive, I'm overly confident. There's plenty of examples where it looks like when I try to present my confidence, I come across as aggressive. But the theme about empathy and inclusion and the community it means the world to me.
But why shouldn't you be able to be aggressive, right? That's a great characteristic.
Yeah.
But and I think
100%.
destigmatizing that as well.
Yeah, and we all try to over-prepare for all of these investor meetings that, yeah, you do come across as prepared, which makes many of them think you're aggressive. Julia, this was absolutely inspiring.
You are an inspiration to me. Thank you so much for being in my book.
Thank you. Thank you for the privilege to be included. And we will be around here for another half an hour, so if you have other questions, please feel free to ask Julia directly. I feel honored to have her in our office today, and I really hope to see you again in a few months.
I will be back. And also, I did read the audio version of my book, so for those of you stuck in Boston traffic, you could listen to me as well.
Really sorry. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank
You
you.
should take a picture in front of the Insurify.
Yes, we will have. Maybe he will take a picture of us.
Yeah.